This is not even remotely the video I had planned for this week, but I think it's important to talk about before this whole narrative gets way too far out of the gates. I want to start with a quick prayer though for the National Guardsmen, the one who has died and the one who is still in critical condition. God, please hold them near to you and their families and work this out for your will, and please heal the one who is still with us and rest the other one's soul with you forever. Amen. All right, that being said, this entire thing is a false flag, and the only thing I believe about the story we're being told is that this violent act did occur. Based on our prayer, I think my views on the matter of Islam should be pretty clear, but I cannot in good conscience let this false flag just slide right by because it happened to a people and happened using a people that I disagree with. What is going on in the media is sickening to me, and they're taking the deaths of these two people and using it to promote some awful, awful stuff. I really try not to get into politics, but this is pissing me off. We are now promoting the exact same stuff that got us into the last desert wars right here, right now, and it's happening right before our eyes. You have people like JD Palantir Vance who are promoting some awful ideas based on completely wrong facts. For instance, the tweet he released the day this event happened that says the following: I remember back in 2021 criticizing the Biden policy of opening the floodgate to unvetted Afghan refugees. Friends sent me messages calling me a racist. It was a clarifying moment. They shouldn't have been in our country. Who are you referring to? Which unvetted people are you referring to? Because if it's the shooter, who we're going to get into, then he's the exact opposite of unvetted. In fact, he's more vetted than you or I would have been, which is why this is so suspicious. And it's what stupid and gullible people have fallen for so many times. In the early 2000s with the Bush narrative, you know what? We didn't know as well then. We didn't have the same access to information that we do now. But there's no excuse for falling for this one. It's obvious what's happening. Getting into the story though, I knew something was wrong the moment the news broke. The Trump admin is using the same lines across the media that this is Biden's fault and it's the previous administration's fault, and is taking none of the blame. Something that apparently every president likes to do, and every time it sounds like a 4-year-old on the playground who doesn't want to get in trouble. In this case though, Biden is being blamed, even by the White House accounts on Twitter and other platforms, for allowing the alleged shooter in. The shooter being Ramallah Lakwanow. I pronounced that name wrong. I promise you I'm not going to pronounce it correctly a single time. However, it's undeniable that this guy would have been more well vetted than you or I. So this whole narrative that we had no idea who he was or that he was some radical kind of falls apart from the first step. And at face value, it does seem though like JD Vance is correct and we should be blaming Biden. But that would be untrue. Initially there was this narrative that this guy had overstayed his visa by 2 months and was supposed to go home. But that's not actually true whatsoever. In April of 2025, by the Trump admin, he was granted asylum to stay here in the United States. So at this point, throw all the political crap out, it's bull, and there's absolutely no reality to it. And if you are one of those people pointing fingers online, you're wrong. This isn't politics anymore. We're way beyond that. And now, since Rom was allowed to stay here via both administrations, we're going to have to go back and we're going to have to reassess who he actually is. Originally, Rom was invited to America under the Allies Welcome Agreement, which was a special opportunity for Afghanis who had served alongside the United States in the United States military, serving our interests over there. It basically let them come here and live in America so they could avoid the awful fate that awaited them when the Taliban was given control of Afghanistan. It's a really special thing that not everyone got who helped us out over there. And to be on this list means you probably had at least some connections in the government and were at least relatively an important figure. Especially that is to get your whole family to be able to come over here with you as well. And for 4 years, this Rom guy was completely fine, no blips on the radar, and yet after 4 years of living peaceably in America, he decided to take one of the longest drives you can in the United States from Washington State to Washington, D.C. They're on opposite sides of the country for foreigners, and then randomly assault and kill one and nearly a second National Guardsman on the streets of Washington, D.C. Something then just doesn't make sense there as it stands. Obviously, if Rom's goal was to make some sort of point for Islam, then why did he drive all the way to D.C.? There are plenty of National Guardsmen in other places, or bigger incidents he could have carried out more easily and likely more quote-unquote successfully than what he did that day. After all, he did just enter a city with an increased police force. And more than that, he didn't even take advantage of the fact that it was Washington, D.C., and maybe do something with one of the historical buildings there or a political official. It was literally just 2 random National Guardsmen on patrol. And I want to reiterate here that there is this story that Rom had overstayed his visa by 2 months, but that's entirely made up. I'm not sure where it began, but this man had an asylum status. He wasn't overstaying his visa, And I think that was said to continue promoting this narrative of, oh, everyone who's here is bad, when in reality that's just not true. This was someone who had served America more loyally than most Americans. So something else has to be going on. So why then was this story given of the visa? Because it's further divisive. It paints Rom as just another brownie who needed to go bye-bye because he's bad, or whatever Laura Loomer, that degenerate online, is saying. But that can't make sense, as we will get to. Shortly after the shooting began, though, rumors started that this Rom fellow had also been working for the CIA while in Afghanistan, and that he was an asset of theirs. So not only is he here legally, he's also a CIA agent, or at least was. And because I suppose the CIA can't keep their hands out of anything, anywhere, they really were actively engaged in Afghanistan in a lot of ways. Surprise, surprise, shortly thereafter, an ID photo emerged of what is meant to be this Rom fellow and his identification that allowed him access to various military bases and showed that he was an American ally. And now we have two bizarre facts. The first, that he worked for the CIA, and the second, that we have his ID photo. And if you paused and took a second and avoided all the political rhetoric, you might realize that two incredibly bizarre things just occurred. The first being that the CIA admitted to wrongdoing. What? The CIA has been involved in so many psyops and false flags over the decades and almost century at this point that they've existed, and yet they almost never take the blame, and when they do, it's decades later, if at all. Like for instance, OKC, which their hands are all over. Quite literally, I ask you, name 3 times the CIA ever took the blame for something that they did wrong within the first few days of that event happening. You're not gonna find it. And then for this ID photo to get leaked that proves he worked for the CIA? Yeah, what? Where did that even come from? It appears to be a photo of a photo on a digital screen. So is this someone's database that has access to this information? Or I don't know what, because who could have had this and then leaked it? And in fact, to answer that very question, I tried just plain reverse image searching this and couldn't find any existing files online that were the known repository for it. So who got this? I don't know, but it's clearly a government document if it's real and genuine, so it had to have come from a government source. So then if we assume that since it's a CIA related identification badge, then it's not ridiculous to assume that this photo came from a CIA operative of some kind. So then why is the CIA admitting guilt and then giving us evidence of their guilt like that? They never do that. I cannot name another instance where the CIA has done something like this, and that is way too weird for me to look over. Moreover, when you start doing the math, this Rom guy supposedly worked for the CIA for a decade or more, and that would mean that he was recruited at the age of 15 or so, which I don't know how common that is, but that seems further suspicious. Like, this is the sort of guy who was deeply connected. And obviously he was, like we said, his entire family also got asylum alongside him in the United States, and the government was subsidizing his time here and his at least $2,000 a month apartment. And we get a little bit of a hint at the stuff he was involved in, or might have been involved in, when we think about the fact that he was in what was known as a zero unit, which was a unit primarily made up of Afghanis in Afghanistan that the CIA essentially controlled fairly directly or just directly, and they would carry out the most horrifying, dangerous, and deadly missions that the US military wanted done in Afghanistan. These zero units were extremely effective, extremely violent, and known for having no holds barred even when it came to women and children. But beyond all that, they are known for being cunning and effective. And they're made up of, oftentimes, there are some criminals in there, and there are oftentimes other ultra well-trained soldiers that just happen to be Afghani, and they would all come together and they would form these units alongside the US military and fight alongside the US military and live alongside the US military and be friends with the US military. Many of these were interpreters who would communicate directly with the enemy and with the United States. That would make them some of the most valuable and loyal members of our operations over there. So Rom, if he was such an American hater, despite receiving all these incredible benefits from the US Army and the US government, it wouldn't make sense for him to wait until now to instage some attack against the US when he had access to US military soldiers in their most vulnerable points for a decade while he was in Afghanistan. And beyond all the things he's received from the US military, Rom would have been fully aware that if he were to engage in an attack like this for whatever reason, despite we have no reason or motive, shocker, we never get a motive, but however, despite if you believe that Rom's the guy and there's nothing wrong with this story, you do have to ask yourself what Rom was thinking then, because this would mean that his family is going to be sent back to Afghanistan, where they are likely going to be beheaded, tortured, and raped in front of one another, including his children. The Taliban has no sense of forgiveness. So then what was Rom thinking? And if it's him, what could have motivated him into engaging in such a deplorable act as he conducted? A question that further proves that nothing about this situation makes any sense. And so I find it worth noting that since we know very little about Rom, and the only information we have about him seems to come from the government, because it's not uncommon, in fact it's frequent at this point, that the CIA has conducted operations on American citizens in order to get them to engage in such activities like foreign wars. As for the guardsmen themselves, we prayed for them earlier, and I do want to reiterate, I'm not at all doubting that the awful thing that happened to them. I'm just doubting the story that we're being told about it. That being said, I think it's important to note that something is very wrong with the fact that these two guards were the ones who were targeted. And I do mean targeted, as we very clearly will see shortly, they were. However, unlike many situations in these sorts of instances, I don't think it's for what they knew. I think it's because they had really no knowledge. So they were, in the eyes of maybe a military engaging in such an operation as staging its own false flag, expendable. And I say that with an absolute knowledge that there is no human life that is worth losing or expendable, especially when it comes to those who are willing to sacrifice their lives to save others. I'm only saying expendable in the eyes of the government, as they're both brand new National Guard members and had only been deployed within the past 24 hours. Moreover, considering that they were rookies, we also know that they were deployed unarmed or with unloaded weapons, which would explain why they didn't fight back. Because most don't know this, the National Guard, when they're put on the streets, unless in specific situations, are unarmed. The majority of them are, unless you're higher ranking. It's not exactly known the system and why they do this or how they go about selecting who will be armed and unarmed, but two brand new National Guardsmen are just sitting ducks. There's no shot they're gonna be able to fight back because they don't have any method of fighting back, especially when someone pulls up on them with a revolver, as is said to have happened. The shooting itself, though, there was very little reporting on. I have all of the footage, or at least the majority of the footage that was taken by people with their cameras, and I did notice that the bus station glass is shattered, which kind of confuses me because it just doesn't really make sense based on where the bodies are positioned later on. I can't really show you that imagery here, so I'm not gonna go too deep into it, but I have further questions about what happened there and if maybe more shots were fired than we're told. And my only other question about the shooting that I'm really gonna ask, because of how little information there is, once again, is who is this guy that shows up in all these videos wearing shorts on a super cold day in Washington, D.C.? I have no idea who he is. He doesn't have a 3-letter agency jacket on. He just seems to be running around, seems to be in command to some degree, because the first responders and National Guard are just listening to him and helping him out, but I have no idea who this is. It hasn't come out that this guy was save some lives or anything like that. He's just there, it seems. And if you have any ideas who this is, or if I'm missing something, please feel free to comment, because I am very curious. But the lead up to these events reveals far more to us, I think, than the actual events themselves. For instance, in the days before the shooting, there's a spike in searches for Sarah Beckstrom, the guard who has now passed away, coming from Israel. There is no other time where you can see a spike like this in search results for her and in searches for her. And obviously, it being from Israel, it's not really at all that surprising, considering how deeply involved they are in staging these sorts of things in the past. But what is gallows humor funny, and I don't mean funny like haha, I mean like oh my goodness, is how idiotic these people would have to be for making it so obvious, which makes me think that maybe this is another part of the false flag. I don't know, but I certainly wouldn't be shocked to find out that that nation was involved in this. That being said, there are also spikes in search results for the other guardsman who was shot and the shooter in Washington, D.C., as well as Israel, unsurprisingly, in the weeks prior to these events. And it's beyond anything that could be expected. It's not like it was a few. We're talking 100 plus in some instances, even more than that, proving that people were looking up these individuals and also proving, therefore, that it was staged. Both who was there that day to be executed, as well as who was going to be the executioner. And once again, there's no similar data in the previous search results to show that this just happened by coincidence and that these people were frequently looked up. Like I said, they're brand new to the National Guard. They have really no social media presence, so no one's looking them up unless you know who you're looking for. And I find that there being this reference to Israel, it's important to notice the rhetoric then that's now going on. That being an increased distrust and even hatred from many for the Muslim populations in America and abroad. People like Laura Loser, or realistically, most allegedly conservative, whatever that means anymore, pundits, who are already chomping at the bit, calling all Muzzies evil baby killers and telling them to get out of here. I don't want to be in the position to defend Muslims, but I will if I have to. That's just not true. They're not all bad, man. It feels like the lead up to the Desert Wars, and I don't like that. It's really dark. It makes me sick but it's very clear someone is playing us. And another dividing line is being placed in between us, distracting us from the important things like the real enemy and those Epstein files that seem to keep being pushed back to the wayside. That being said, if we were to presume that Rom is the real shooter, which would mean that he's gained 100 pounds and his face seems to change for every photo that I've seen him in, and the wounds that he allegedly sustained aren't actually on his body in the photos that we have of him, where he's also been stripped nude, which I thought was odd. That all being said, let's just say Rom's the same guy and that he is a CIA agent and all that, whatever. Then why? Why? Seriously, answer that question for me. Conservative pundit, with all we know about this guy and what he did for the US and the loyalty that's been shown both ways from him and to him, why would this man who's fiercely pro-American, or at least anti-Islamic terror, do this? He has zero motive. And I genuinely think that he was, like so many, approached in secret. I think that he was forced into doing this. He has a family after all, and I do imagine that it's not beyond the scope of the government to go, yeah, we need you to do this for us, or, you know, maybe you just go back to Afghanistan, or something like that. I don't know. But I do think that something obviously happened to have this loyal pro-America guy then turn against Americans and the people he fought alongside. And so then I'm gonna have to look at the other people who are going to benefit from something like this, and there are two countries that come to mind. They've already been mentioned so far. I think you can figure that out for yourself. That being said though, it does happen to coincide very nicely with this clip that I think you should watch, because it reveals a lot of what the opposition thinks about you and wants from the American people.
Over at Dropsite and here at Breaking Points, we have obtained quite an interesting document. This is the result of a number of private focus groups done around the world, paid for by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and leaked to us. So we're going to roll through some of the findings here, but to back up, the purpose of this project is clear. It is to test what messages will work for Israel going forward, particularly, quote unquote, after the war, in order to try to regain some of the international legitimacy and standing that they have lost over the years. They did 15 focus groups, 6 in the United States, 3 groups each in the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. They also did what they call quantitative message testing, 8,050 total interviews, 3,250 interviews in the US, 1,200 each in UK, Germany, France, and Spain. This is to set a baseline, a starting point, to find out where people are now when it comes to their opinions on Israel. Spoiler, people in Spain do not like Israel's conduct. And then phase 3, what they call animatic testing. This is 5,600 interviews, 4,000 in the US and 1,600 in UK and Europe, which isn't totally complete, but by the time that this was put out, but is testing specific, what they call messages, tone, and delivery. So what are they doing? They're sitting down with people. This is very expensive work, by the way. Oh, yeah. Millions and millions. And it's going to Stagwell Group, which is Mark Penn's firm.
Interesting.
Yeah, Mark Penn, former Clinton guy, now more of a Fox News Trump guy.
Sort of centrist.
Yeah.
Third way time.
What a quirky. Anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
You can look him up. Go down the Mark Penn rabbit hole if you want. He and his wife are involved with No Labels. They launched No Labels.
There you go. We just explained it perfectly.
Yeah, there you go. So what they do these focus groups, and then they do telephone interviews, get baseline, and then they go back to people and try to figure out what can move people from their current basement level views of Israel to something that gives them some level of international legitimacy and avoids the isolation that is quite obviously coming their way. To short circuit and get right to the chase, effectively what they recommend is ramping up Islamophobia. They argue that when Israel is compared to when Israel is compared to Iran or Hamas, people generally prefer Israel to Iran or Hamas. And they also then survey people's attitudes, particularly in Europe, towards Muslim immigrants, and find that there are a lot of people in Europe who have some underlying hostility towards Muslims in Europe. And so Israel's argument is lean into that, lean into that kind of comparison, and say that we are the ones that are standing up against the horde, basically. Just key findings on page 3. International attitudes toward Israel and the conflict are consistently worse in Europe than in the United States, particularly in the UK, France, and especially in Spain. Most Europeans support the quote Palestinians, except in Germany, over Israel, but they do recoil against both Hamas and Iran. So when they compare Israel to Hamas and Iran, Israel polls better. When they say, do you prefer Palestinians or the Israelis or Israel, Palestinians wins out handily. 18 to 24-year-olds are uniformly the worst performing group, though attitudes in Spain are across the board negative to Israel, so everybody in Spain.
They, and by that I mean both governments domestic and abroad, want another conflict. It's painfully obvious. Their bloodlust cannot be satiated. And they have done an excellent job in the past of making people think that all these terror attacks are accidental and silencing those who oppose that opinion. But today, I do find that now more than ever, people are waking up and going, wait, that doesn't actually make sense. So I compel you, trust your gut. It does not make sense. Do we have an illegals problem in this country? Yes. Do they need to be gotten out of here? Yes. Can a country exist without firm borders? No. But is this the answer? Posts like this? No. Those are dividing, not uniting us to an existing problem. Most Afghanis would agree that there is a problem with the number of people who have gotten into this country and the potential that they are involved in actual terrorist organizations. And this guy would have been one of them. So what are we talking about right now, you all? Why do we immediately assume the worst and trust the most untrustworthy people ever? They're all named in the book from the guy who was orchestrating the of kids on behalf of the nation that is searching up people right before this happens. And I cannot help but think that we have now been played for years and that this ROM situation is just the pawn being moved on the board of something far larger than we can imagine. So now I'm going to give a little bit of a history lesson to connect this ROM situation to what I think is really going on. And if you're one of those people who think that politics is actually the answer to our problems, then you are going to think this is insane. I want to point to the last major terror leader of the globe, that being Osama bin Laden. He was the face of terrorism in the world for so long, he kind of just became ubiquitous with the word itself. But what most neglect to mention is that Osama bin Laden is the byproduct of CIA involvement, funding, and training. The CIA will never admit it. Mainstream media is going to tell me if they see this that I'm an idiot and that I'm a conspiracy theorist and that the government would never do that. It's blatantly true and blatantly obvious, and it's already known that the CIA was funding all sorts of people in Afghanistan.
To be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting. How? Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan. And we were successful. The Soviets left Afghanistan, and then we said, great, goodbye, leaving these trained people who were fanatical in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leaving them well armed, creating a mess, frankly, that at the time we didn't really recognize. We were just so happy to see the Soviet Union fall, and we thought, okay, fine, we're okay now. Everything's going to be so much better. Now you look back, the people we're fighting today, we were supporting in the fight against the Soviets.
So we have an example there of CIA involvement with major figures in this global terror world. And then you also add in the fact that Osama bin Laden was trained and educated in the West, and the fact that he was personally worth $100 million, and his family's combined net worth is over $10 billion, money for which came almost entirely from American connections and American benevolence. You sort of have to wonder then why that guy would suddenly begin hating the West when he is literally the product of the West. A guy then who would have zero incentive to go and fight the United States or orchestrate events that he definitely didn't. So now I'm going to connect Ram to Osama. You have two people who are deeply indebted to the West, whose lives are dependent on the West, who have served the West, who suddenly are turned against the West for unknown reasons. Like I referenced, during this time the CIA was actually funding and arming a lot of freedom fighters in Afghanistan to overthrow the current government. But during that process, the CIA and the government had then armed its next enemy in these desert areas, that being the Taliban, and ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same thing. And then suddenly from that emerged this figure who was indebted to the West to lead this now well-armed militia in Afghanistan to cause attacks everywhere. It seems really convenient. Attacks that were carried out using American weapons and wars that were fought using American and Soviet weapons. And then I now want to take you back to an event that happened in 2021 that's been brought up in connection to Ram. That being that Ram came here, part of the Allies Welcome Program under Biden, one of those planes that we saw the videos of leaving Afghanistan after we shamefully left that country to rot. For a long time, and really up until this moment when I was writing this video, I thought that that was a genuine political foible. I never connected it to what I actually think it is now. We all know that the US government, despite denying it at certain points, left billions of dollars worth of equipment over there. The top of the line everything. We left them drones, night vision, the best weapons, the best armor, the best kits, the best tanks, the best planes, the best helicopters, literally everything. We left them entire military bases, millions of rounds of ammo, cash, gold, whatever you can imagine, we left it there. So what did we do? We just armed our supposed enemy with the best equipment on Earth that you can see them parading it around in, and just expected nothing to happen. And for 4 years, just about nothing has happened. You have all these well-armed people, but they've remained over there by themselves. But now we're seeing the first instance of someone who used to fight the Taliban, who's living in America, going out and attacking American soldiers. Well, I would imagine then that this won't be the only instance of that. So what I realized then is that this ROM situation is not very dissimilar to what happened in the lead up to the endless desert wars. We have Trump adding 500 more National Guard troops to DC that are going to be basically unarmed and just sitting ducks. And we also now have the Taliban with all the US military's equipment that's ready to fight at any time. And then you have someone like ROM who'd worked with the US government and the CIA carrying out an attack that makes no sense. We already know the attack was staged because the people searching it beforehand. I'm just gonna say allegedly though because of the platform we're on. And I'm not even gonna read from my script for this. I think it's as obvious as this. We have an incredibly well-armed Taliban army and a bunch of people from Afghanistan who are indebted to the United States who could easily be coerced by the United States into carrying out attacks to make Muslims look bad. I don't think it takes much to assume that if you combine these two things, the US government could easily go, oh man, look at this terrible threat who's funding all these attacks in America. We have to go fight them, especially now that Biden gave them all this great equipment. And there you go. Now we have another endless desert war to further weaken the United States, to further radicalize the Middle Eastern countries, and to further empower one specific country that was involved in searching up all of these people prior to their execution. And this may sound crazy, but it really isn't. If you know anything about history and the babies in the incubators, the government's been doing this for forever. It's just the way they do things. The USS Maine, the Gulf of Tonkin, everything. It keeps happening. And then I want to combine that with other things we're seeing online. Like I said, the lore loser posts talking about how all Muzzies are bad. Or JD Vance saying that they shouldn't have been here. When in reality, it's equally both political parties' faults, but they're not going to admit that. So you have this heated rhetoric, this increasing hatred for Muslims, and another military fully armed in Afghanistan. I think it's obvious where this is going, and I don't think it's going to take very long. So I anticipate that there are going to be more attacks, and that there are going to be more events of radicalization that take place that we're going to have to be on the lookout for now. And we're going to start seeing warnings from the government of where you shouldn't fly here, and be on the lookout for these kinds of people. I am almost certain it's going to happen, and I'm willing to wager within the next few months we're going to see more attacks like this. And they're going to get worse and worse, and at some point there's going to be a major false flag event, and most Americans are probably going to fall for it. Unfortunately for the mainstream though, I don't think all Americans will. And I think too many of us are willing to talk about what's actually going on for them to fully get away with this. And we're also going to see other events where you have quote-unquote Christians and quote-unquote white Americans who are going to be inciting Muslims to anger and all that, and vice versa. And I think it's all going to be staged. And we've already seen this happening. Like the case of Jake Lang, who is an actual Jew and a spook, dressing up and pretending to be a Christian and going to a Christian rally and inciting people to go and then start fights and arguments with these Muslims and anti-Trump protesters, increasing the political angst in this country that is already at an all-time high. It's hard to think this is just coincidental. You have a spook who's been spooking for years, trying to spook some more.
Yeah, I am Jewish. If you say anything negative about Israel, I am Jewish. My sister served in the IDF. I was bar mitzvahed on the Wailing Wall in Israel.
I don't know. I just hope you don't fall for it. Please. It's gonna get emotionally heated. I think we're all feeling that something big is coming. Do not give in to your emotions. Think before you act, and I can only advise caution here. The enemy is not the left, the enemy is not the right. We are all the same. Do not lose sight of what's happening. For the record though, mighty convenient that those Epstein documents are now getting covered up again by both the CK incident and now this, and whatever is going to happen next, because do not expect this ROM situation to be the last. Things are only escalating in this country, and unless we de-escalate them, it's going to get really bad really fast. So that's my thoughts, you guys. Thank you very much for watching. Please stay vigilant. It's all going to happen, and it's going to get crazy, but we can be all right. We can come through this. God bless you guys. I look forward to seeing each and every one of you in the next one.